everybody. Welcome to this week's War and Peace Lecture Series. We're joined by Michael Nagler from the Communications Department, who's going to be speaking to us for the very first time today, so we're very excited about that. He's going to be speaking about America as global vigilante. He's an expert in the field of communications and public relations, so he's going to talk about the work the governments are doing in order to sell their awards for public relations. So please give us welcome to Professor Nagler from the Communications.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. I should probably adjust that a little bit in that I'm not really going to talk much about sort of willful or intentional public relations on the part of, let's say, the United States government trying to sell what they do. This is going to be more about the messages that Hollywood movies send to us, often in ways that we're not fully aware of. Hollywood movies can tell us things, communicate things to us that can be actually of profound importance to how we feel about ourselves, about our country, and our place in the world. And that includes foreign policy. So the title of my talk is America as Global Vigilante. I'm not going to be arguing necessarily that America is a global vigilante, but I'm going to be arguing that part of what Hollywood movies do, for the most part, I would say unintentionally, is they kind of make an argument for the idea that America maybe could and should be a global vigilante. And that's not even necessarily through movies that are about war or terrorism or foreign policy. It's oftentimes just action movies, crime movies, adventure movies. Oftentimes they don't even have anything to do with war or foreign policy, but they're making that kind of argument under the surface nonetheless. So when it comes to foreign policy and deciding what America's role in the world should be and what we should think about that, there's maybe an ideal model that we might have in mind about how that should work in an American system, a democratic system where the people in part rule. That kind of ideal model of our public opinion arrived at individually and then made up collectively of all of us and what we believe, political governmental decision-making, and foreign policy. It might include thoughtful discourse, an informed, engaged, rational citizenry. It might feature long-term planning, intercultural and international understanding, humanistic values and principles that we live up to, news media as sober watchdogs, and enlightened and courageous political leadership from those we have elected to high offices. Well, that's plainly not what we actually have for the most part. For the most part, things are a great deal less ideal and less perfect than that. For, I would say, most of us, I would include myself in this, I would include journalists, pundits, politicians, President Obama. I would include all of us as not necessarily always being that fully informed, enlightened, rational, reasoned thinker when it comes to something like foreign policy. We often, and this is just human nature, and it's something that's discussed thoroughly in psychology, social psychology, and a lot of other fields, we often lean on what are called heuristics and schemas, which are essentially mental shortcuts of various kinds that we use sometimes because we're overwhelmed by information, and sometimes because we are working with not a heck of a lot of information, but they are useful to us and we lean on them just the same. We often lean on those things to make sense of the world around us and what, for example, in this case, American foreign policy should be. So, for example, today, like literally today and for the last several days, ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, that's in the news as a sort of new foreign policy crisis that we all have to think about, we all have to, ruminate on, we all have to sort of contemplate what is the best American foreign policy in the face of something like ISIS. So there's been a lot of discussion throughout the news media from pundits, from citizens, politicians. President Obama came out today and said that we need a plan that includes a great deal of military might and that he's not necessarily going to be dependent on congressional approval to go forward with his plan. ISIS is a threat. It has emerged as a threat. We need to confront it. And, how we all as citizens, even pundits and politicians who presumably often know better than your average citizen, what we decide to do about that, we're often taking shortcuts to get there, to figure out what we should do. One common shortcut that we might use is analogies. Doesn't necessarily mean analogies are bad, or in fact that mental shortcuts just in general are bad. But just as an example, an analogy that you hear quite often on cable news and have for many years now, certainly since September 11, 2001, goes like this. The world is like a schoolyard, and foreign terrorists and dictators are the bullies. Simple as that. And you have to hit bullies hard enough that they never bully you again. Damn right. Now, that carries such simple force that in the face of it, you kind of figure, I got no argument against that. Can't do anything about that. That just seems so plainly true. Whoever came up with that won that argument. Let's move on. But no, if you employ a little bit of critical thinking skills, you come to the conclusion that, that's a bad analogy. That's not a worthwhile analogy. That's not necessarily a useful mental shortcut for us to figure out what, we should do when it comes to foreign policy or, terrorist threats around the world. Just as an example, and this is off the top of my head, if you're confronting a schoolyard bully and you swing to try to hit that bully in the stomach and you miss, you probably aren't going to kill 2,000 other kids on the playground. Right? Or if you hit that bully really hard in the stomach and that bully is, crying on the ground in pain, all of that bully's countrymen, ancestors, friends, religious peers are probably not going to be newly inspired to be bullies in the future on that same playground. And, finally, it might be a good idea for us to figure out why that bully is such a bully so that we don't have to keep confronting bullies. Maybe a little long-term thinking and planning and considering what's going on outside the box might be a good idea. So that might sound really appealing, and it might sound really good as a mental shortcut for making sense of something like foreign policy, but there are limitations to those things. Another example of what we might lean on when it comes to thinking about something like foreign policy is our immersion, whether we're that aware of it or not, in America's most common cultural myths and narratives. The kinds of storylines and kind of taken for granted ideals that are just sort of part of the air we breathe as we grow up. Those of us here who might be American citizens, those of us who grow up in America, that we consume those narratives, we soak up those myths, and they tend to hold lessons for us. And a lot of those myths and narratives and the lessons that they hold for us, they can be found when we encounter Hollywood movies. And as I said, it's not even necessarily movies that are about war or about foreign policy. There are a heck of a lot of lessons that we learn, even when that's not even the subject matter. So what kind of narratives do we tend to be immersed in when we are engaged with Hollywood movies? This is probably not something that many of us think much about in any kind of conscious way, but the underlying architecture of Hollywood movies is 99% the same. 99% the same. If you are setting out to write a Hollywood movie, this is the structure. You can say, no, I'm going to do something different, man. I'm not going to play by those rules. Good luck selling your screenplay and having it be made into a movie. This is the underlying structure of 99% of Hollywood movies. It's made up of 3 acts. The first act, in most screenwriting terminology, is called the setup. In the middle to the end of the first act, there's what is called an inciting incident. And the terminology is kind of telling, actually. An inciting incident. By the end of the first act, usually by minute 25, something happens that launches us into the rest of the movie, into the second act, and what's typically called the confrontation. That's the terminology used, the confrontation. By the end of the second act, where the protagonist is usually confronting a whole bunch of obstacles of different kinds, whether it's a romantic comedy or the kind of like, vigilante action movie that I'm talking about, by the end of the second act, there's a low point where it seems like all hope is lost. But what does our protagonist do? Does he, and it's, distressingly common for it just to be a he, does he sort of just go home crying with his tail between his legs? No! He redoubles his efforts, decides, no, this is too important to give up now, and he charges forward, still desperate to solve the problem in front of him, and we arrive at a resolution. And, the vast majority of Hollywood movies, the problem gets solved. There's a problem, the obstacles and the problem are confronted, and sometimes they are significant. Sometimes the odds are stacked against you. No matter, you'll overcome them, oftentimes with violence, oftentimes doing things outside the law, and you'll solve the problem. By the end of the movie, you have a happy ending. You might say, oh, but I want to make a movie that doesn't have a happy ending, where someone has some serious problems that they're confronting and things go wrong and it ends sadly. Again, good luck getting that movie made. That's not what Hollywood movies tend to be. They're about serious problems being confronted and solved and arriving at a happy ending. And all of this takes place in a single closed story, which from beginning to end, from when the problem arises and you have the inciting incident to then getting solved, lasts like an hour and a half, 2 hours, a closed story. Problem, take action, problem gets solved, happy ending, thank you for coming. You can validate your parking down the hall. Now, it begs asking, what kinds of movie confrontations and resolutions might fit comfortably in that kind of narrative structure, and which would not? Some things might be a little too complicated to fit well within that kind of narrative structure. And some things, especially in movies, which is a visual medium, and by this point, especially with our changing attention spans, needs to move fast. Certain things are going to fit in that kind of structure, and certain things are not. Walter Fisher, who studied narrative paradigms and just the importance of narratives in general in our lives, he argued that narratives give shape to our experience. They give definition to what we understand to be true, what we believe in, who we are, and that the kinds of narrative paradigms that we are most immersed in, most invested in, most used to, they further give shape to what we are going to understand the world to be. Furthermore, when it comes to the power of narratives, the power of stories to potentially affect us, you could make the argument that Hollywood movies are perfectly positioned to affect us with their stories without us necessarily being aware of it. Because we just figure it's entertainment, right? I mean, if you're going to see an action movie and someone is confronted with some kind of problem, like a friend of theirs gets hurt or kidnapped, and they go on a rampage and they use violence to solve the problem, and then the movie's over, happy ending, and they visit their friend in the hospital, and their friend's going to be okay. Movie's over. We're not going to figure that that has any kind of political message attached to it. We're just going to get immersed and moved emotionally by the story. And there are those who study stories who say that that's precisely the kind of story that can move us and affect us, including our values and what we believe in, without us really realizing it. So Jonathan Gottschall, who wrote the book, The Storytelling Animal, he argues that, when we are engaged with stories, and especially when we understand them to just be stories, nothing more significant than that, and just entertainment, like movies ostensibly are, that we're moved emotionally. And this seems to make us rubbery and easy to shape. So, as part of that, and as part of the narratives that we tend to regularly be engaged with and immersed in, we might want to ask ourselves, well, what kinds of lessons maybe tend to be communicated in those kinds of narratives? Well, those sorts of lessons we could also refer to as essentially taken for granted myths that, again, kind of get communicated under the surface by a lot of the stories that we are engaged with. So Richard Slotkin, who wrote the book Gunfighter Nation, he has written that we resort to our myths not merely to evade the discontents of our historical moment, but to find something, a precedent, a bit of wisdom, a new perspective that will allow us to imagine a way of coping with and even transforming the present crisis. So in other words, if we're confronted with something like ISIS, part of what we might be doing is just falling back on the kinds of narratives, the kinds of myths that we're used to in giving shape and definition to our world. We might be falling back on myths like one that he has written about before, which is that we can kind of regenerate and get to where we want to go through violence. That was part, ostensibly, of what Manifest Destiny was. That's what the so-called Indian Wars were all about. That's what, a lot of the wars that America has been engaged in over the years have been about. He would argue that there's a myth in America that we regenerate and we get to where we need to be through violence. And that's kind of embedded in the fiber of America, that's a kind of mythical component of American life. Not that there isn't some of that in other cultures as well, but that there's something very American about that. Susan Faludi, in her book, The Terror Dream, writes about another kind of myth that's been present in America for a long time and came back around very much after September 11th, that myth being the captivity myth or the captivity story, that we are kind of seized with anxiety and deep down collectively fear being attacked by nasty, savage, dark-skinned people and having our women and or children taken from us. And generally speaking, the us is being defined as good white people, and that we constantly have to be on guard because there's always going to be someone out there, nasty, savage, dark-skinned people who are going to take our women and children and do horrible things to them. That is rooted in, times of the settlers and Native Americans. It's rooted in, say, the Jessica Lynch story, which turned out to be a very odd one and didn't really fit the captivity myth. And it's something that you see in a lot of movies. A lot of movies. It provokes a lot of the kind of vigilante, outside the law rampages that you see in a lot of movies. So that's maybe on a relatively collective level, talking about the narratives and myths that Americans are most commonly immersed in when they go see movies. What about on an individual level? What are we getting out of movies when we go see movies? I love movies, personally. I've been a movie geek my whole life. I've seen thousands and thousands of movies, and I will continue to enjoy movies till the day I die. At the same time, partly because I study this, I'm realistic about the fact that the reasons why I like movies and engage with movies are probably more complicated than I realize. I don't think you have to be someone who is, heavily into Freud and psychoanalytic theory to believe that when we go to movies, part of the uses that we get out of them, part of the gratification that we get out of them is that movies are probably oftentimes satisfying unconscious needs that we have, emotions that we feel that we're not necessarily aware of, but that need tending to. So, for example, things like feelings of fear, feelings of powerlessness, feelings of anger. I don't know about you. I'm relatively certain I experience those things deep down. I don't want to be fully conscious of them because that'll make me feel like a loser. So what do? I tamp them down and I use a lot of defense mechanisms to not think that I'm a fearful, powerless, angry person. But my guess is that that's in there somewhere. And that when I'm seeing movies, and movies are satisfying me, like when I'm seeing some action movies and the bad guys are getting blasted away by the hero, and I go, yeah! That's satisfying something in me. I'm not necessarily proud of what that's satisfying in me, but I think that's satisfying something in me more than just, wow, that was a well-crafted, entertaining action movie. Better than most action movies I have seen before. It was very skillfully made, and all of that may be true, but why am I getting moved in the way I'm getting moved? I mean, do any of you ever cry at movies? Laugh at movies? Scream at movies? Yell at movies? Become passionate fans of movies? If so, there's probably something deeper going on there than just, yeah, I like movies, it's entertainment, it's something to do, whatever. No, my guess is that goes a little deeper than that for most of us. So when we go see, let's say, these kinds of movies that I'm talking about that are so common as a staple of Hollywood, where and it's 99% of the time it's a man, where a man has to go outside of the law because the law is for wimps and is ineffective, has to go outside the law to kick ass and exact vengeance and get justice and ensure our security moving forward, that when we watch those kinds of movies, and I can speak for myself personally, I think that satisfies things in me. To the extent that in my life I might sometimes feel powerless, I can identify with the hero who is anything but powerless, and it boosts me. It gives me a buzz. If I'm fearful, if I worry about the safety of my daughter and my son in what seems like a very scary world, knowing that these badass heroes are out there, at least in our fantasies, cleaning up all the bad guys, that satisfies something in me. And if I can vicariously take part in blowing away these bad guys, these assholes who are doing bad things to good people in movies, that can satisfy, that can tend to some of the anger that I might feel. Just living my day-to-day life. Now, you all might feel, you might be thinking, geez, it sounds like you're a fearful, powerless, angry person. I think I'm maybe just a little bit more realistic and honest about the fact that there's more complicated stuff going on inside of us than we might realize, and that movies often speak to those things. The director Mike Nichols, who has directed a lot of movies, The Graduate, The Birdcage, Closer, a whole bunch of other movies, says that movies and audiences are the interconnection of various unconsciouses. That, in other words, oftentimes the people making movies, the stuff that they're making is coming out of their unconscious, that they're not even necessarily completely aware of what they're communicating, and that audiences are not necessarily fully aware of what is being communicated to them. That it's more complicated than that and often taking place under the surface. So thus far, you might be wondering, how is it that Hollywood movies, apart from the fact that they just seem like simple entertainment to me and they're not more complicated than that, apart from that, if you're making the argument that Hollywood movies play a part in foreign policy maybe being more likely to be warlike, conventionally sort of right-wing in its view, very sort of gung-ho American, we deserve to be able to dominate the world in whatever way we like, international law and the United Nations be damned, that might make you a little confused, because we're often led to believe that Hollywood is made up of what? A bunch of gay, liberal, peacenik weirdos who are intent on brainstorming good, decent Americans with their, strange ways. That Hollywood, hey, everybody knows Hollywood is liberal. I would suggest to you that, yes, if you took a poll of all the people who worked in Hollywood, there would be more Democrats than Republicans. Just as if you took a poll of journalists, there would be more Democrats than Republicans. That doesn't mean necessarily that, for example, the media are liberal. And that doesn't mean that what Hollywood makes is liberal. In fact, I would argue that the movies that Hollywood actually makes given how they exist within the parameters, for example, of that narrative structure that we looked at here, and what fits comfortably within that kind of structure, that what Hollywood makes tends to support something very far from liberalism or progressive ideals. Apart from whether you believe in liberal things, apart from whether you believe in progressivism, I think if you actually study what Hollywood makes, that's not what you get from its movies. That's what you get from the movies that wear their politics on their sleeve. So, for example, we're entering into, the so-called prestige months of Hollywood movies leading up to the end of the year and then eventually Oscar time. And those kinds of movies, they tend to be sort of highbrow, high-minded movies about, so for example, last year, about slavery. And clearly, yes, that kind of movie has certain kinds of goals and messages and ideals. But that's not the vast majority of what Hollywood makes. And I would suggest that most of the movies that don't wear their political messages on their sleeve, they're communicating something very different. It's just that we're not generally that aware of it. So Hollywood movies, I would argue, have for a long time communicated messages about how vigilante violence as a means of solving problems makes sense, is worthwhile. It might be messy, and it's certainly not for the meek, but you know what? The law is for wimps. Rules are for wimps. The United Nations, international law, that stuff is for wimps. Real men, real macho men who know what's what, they solve problems outside the law. In fact, the law is often an obstacle to them solving the problems that they want to solve because the law, frankly, it almost seems like it's on the side of the bad guys with all the constitutional rights and so on that they are allowed to enjoy. That's been going on for a long time, and we could see that and a kind of gung-ho Americanism in some war movies, gangster movies, and westerns for many, many years in Hollywood history. But I would argue that in the last 40 years or so, that has accelerated. That beginning with movies like Dirty Harry and Death Wish, and then moving up to a lot of more recent movies like Man on Fire, Drive, The Kingdom, Faster, Zero Dark 30, Taken, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that in the last 40 years, the intensity of these kinds of movies and their frequency has increased. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that movie violence has gotten more explicit after the production code of the 1960s went away and we went to a rating system. And that rating system tends to be pretty permissive when it comes to violence, especially when it's violence that the hero is doing to bad people. So, for example, The Expendables 3, which is just non-stop bloodshed, got a PG-13. Boyhood, which has some bad words in it, got an R. In that kind of context, these kinds of movies have a comfortable home. There has been the steady production of action, adventure, and crime genres, partly in response to the increasingly important foreign markets, which often respond well to those genres. If you're making movies for other countries where the dialogue has to be dubbed, ideally you're going to make movies that don't necessarily have a lot of dialogue. You don't have to dub gunshots for foreign markets. You don't have to dub cars exploding. If people were sitting around talking about how let's share our feelings and overcome these problems by talking it out, that doesn't really work very well for foreign markets. And sometimes foreign markets, that's like 2/3 or 3/4 of what a movie makes. What a movie makes in the United States is sometimes almost irrelevant compared to what it makes in foreign markets. And the people making movies know this now. So that's partly the reason why there aren't nearly as many Hollywood movie dramas, which tend to be people talking and, hashing things out and coming to resolutions without punches, gunshots, stabbings, bombs, etc. Hollywood makes fewer of those than it used to. In part because there are a lot of quality TV dramas today. I mean, why do you have to go to the movies when you can binge watch Breaking Bad? You can binge watch The Good Wife. You can binge watch Mad Men. You can binge watch The Americans. You can binge watch House of Cards. These are TV shows of significant quality, and on the whole, better than the dramas that TV used to make. There's still plenty of television, which is awful, of course, but if you want to see good quality drama, TV or Netflix or Hulu or however you want to get it is a great option. Why are you necessarily going to spend more money to go out to a theater to see a movie drama when you could get something just as good, maybe even better, on your laptop or on your TV? And similarly, in foreign markets, they don't go to American dramas. Dramas tend to be more complicated than action movies do, and they require more dubbing. So in foreign markets, they tend not to go to those kinds of movies. There are a lot of other factors as well. But as someone I come to this subject matter from a lot of different angles, both studying sort of the political messages in media, studying movies and their meanings, and also as someone who has written screenplays for movies. I've written 4 screenplays. I'm brainstorming my 5th now. And I know from experience, from the industry itself, how these kinds of parameters exist on what gets made. So, for example, one of the last things that I wrote was a quirky comedy along the lines of Office Space. And by the way, do you think Office Space made a lot of money in foreign markets? It did not. Didn't even make a lot of money here. But it certainly didn't make a lot of money in foreign markets. And a woman in Hollywood who was reading it and was being very enthusiastic and complimentary about my writing, she suggested that given my skills, this is like a humble brag, given my skills, I should just reorient myself to writing things that are more commercial and more marketable. And the first thing she brought up as what I should be writing was what she called, and I'm quoting her here, white guy with a gun movie. White guy with a gun movie. Think about that for a second. That I should write a white guy with a gun movie. Later, when that script got me, thankfully, literary representation, in talking to my literary manager about what I should write, he said, given the kinds of things that you can write, I think you should go in a less quirky direction, in a more marketable commercial direction. How about an action comedy? Because, yeah, you're good at humor, but that only goes so far, in terms of satisfying an American market. How about an action comedy? So there's jokes for Americans, gunfire for Americans, and a lot of action and explosions for foreign markets. That was Hollywood people telling me what I, as someone who wants to create movies, should write to satisfy what Hollywood wants to make for a variety of reasons. And I'm not constitutionally very capable of taking their advice and running with it, because I have, what you might call guilt associated with kind of, trying to crank out that kind of stuff. So I'm still writing quirky things, and I'll probably get nowhere. Other factors involved, the corporate takeovers of the Hollywood studios since the 1970s, which, the studios used to give slightly more attention to quality and slightly less to short-term profit margins when they weren't owned by conglomerates. Doesn't mean that Hollywood didn't used to make a lot of junk, because Hollywood has always made a lot of junk. We just don't remember it. But they also used to give slightly more attention to quality and slightly less to how many people are in the theaters, how many people are buying the DVDs, how much money are we making, because, our corporate overlords need to know, and they need to know tomorrow. That's changed as well. And the rise of Hollywood blockbusters since the 1970s and accelerating every year since, including video game adaptations, and especially comic book superhero movies and all their sequels and reboots. And we'll talk about that in just a second as well. So what kind of societal context is this taking place in? This rise of, in the last 40 years, more and more of these kind of vigilante action movies where macho men go outside the law to kick ass and get justice in a way that, heck, maybe America, if we want to personify America as sort of our national hero, maybe America should be doing that on on an international scale. What has this period been characterized by? Partly by the rise of white male grievances that, and I'm part of that category, I'm fed up. I'm fed up with all these women and people of color and gays wanting, basic human rights. I'm fed up with that. Things used to be so much easier when I was just 100% in charge. Now I'm only like 98% in charge, and man, that really gets my goat. Economic insecurity, more seriously, in my view, economic security, that's something real that men, including white men, have had to confront more and more often since the 1970s. Crime, the seeming, chaos and sort of runaway crime rates that America has experienced, although they've been going down pretty steadily for the last 20 years. You just don't hear much about that. Youth culture, kids today with all their newfangled ideas and Snapchats and bad language and loose morals and drug taking, and damn it, it's not the way things were when I was a kid. White men have their grievances. They have anger about not feeling like they have the same power and standing that they used to. The end to the Vietnam War, a war that the United States essentially lost, and the particular kinds of memories and lessons that many people have learned from that, such as the odd notion that a lot of pundits and politicians tending to be right-leaning communicate. President Reagan communicated this sort of thing often. Sylvester Stallone in Rambo and Chuck Norris in Missing in Action communicated this, that the United States would have won in Vietnam if only the politicians and the bureaucrats and the journalists and the goddamn hippie protesters had let the military take the gloves off and really fight the Vietnam War. But we kind of pussyfooted around and did things too soft and carefully and never really waged war in the way we should have, which would be news to, the Vietnamese and, the people in that area who got bombed to an incredible extent in Vietnam. It would be news to like the author of Kill Anything That Moves, a book that came out last year that explains in detail the extent to which America fought Vietnam real hard and with incredible intensity. The fact that it didn't work the way the United States military and its political, structure wanted doesn't mean that war wasn't waged with grave intensity. The fact that America's global power and standing and efficacy is perceived to be in decline, that's talked about regularly. The accelerated demonization and trivialization of just basic things like government, public institutions, infrastructure, constitutional rights. The criminal justice system, which is thought to be too soft and on the side of the criminals. The United Nations, diplomacy, and so on. A lot of this goes in the face of the fact that, for example, when it comes to the criminal justice system, the law and the trends have been going in a very punitive, conservative direction for decades now. And for example, every day, new police abuse scandals come to light, prosecutor scandals come to light, wrongful conviction scandals come to light. And we saw, in Ferguson, Missouri, how the last 40 years or so, during this time period where ostensibly the criminal justice system and police forces are too soft, we've seen the militarization of the police, that the police have gotten stronger and stronger and more powerful with more militarized weaponry, and yet we see criminal justice as too soft and needing macho heroes to compensate for it. Kind of strange. There's a little bit of down is up, up is down to that. TV news and its simplicity and the way it covers things. And of course, the attacks and the collective trauma of September 11, 2001 and their aftermath. This is the context for the rise of these kinds of movies, which I would argue puts in our heads the idea that problems that emerge can be readily solved with violence, and violence that doesn't play according to the rules. So, for example, if we're talking about foreign policy and we're confronted with something like ISIS, military might is what's necessary, and we shouldn't necessarily play by the rules, because the rules are for wimps. Rules get in the way of success. Rules get in the way of justice, security, and so on. So this is just a sampling of recent Hollywood, what I'm calling Vigilante-Violence-As-Justice movies. This is just from the last 9 or 10 years or so. And this page could have gone on and on and on. I would point you in particular to some of these kinds of movies where, for example, torturing bad guys, and, if they're bad guys, they kind of deserve to be tortured. Am I right? Am I right? I'm kidding. There are a number of movies on this list that essentially advocate for the usefulness and the appropriateness of torture. That torturing bad guys to accomplish what you need is appropriate. So in movies like Kill Bill, in Machete, in Sin City, in The Punisher, in Zero Dark 30, which ostensibly tells the true story of the manhunt for Osama bin Laden, and the very useful role that torture supposedly played in that hunt. I could go on. Man on Fire. These are movies where torture works. It's necessary and it works. Well, up until just recently, when the waters became very muddied, torture was illegal. Illegal in the United States, illegal as far as international law. But you know what? If evil is evil and we are good and we have goals and we need revenge and we need to protect ourselves, hey, let's torture. That's the message underneath the surface of a lot of these kinds of movies. And that list doesn't even include that many superhero movies. Now, superhero movies on the whole, you might not think, well, that's not really like revenge-taking, vigilante, ass-kicking macho men, crushing the bad guys outside the law. It's superheroes doing superhero things. But superheroes aren't usually part of the criminal justice system. They usually aren't part of the law. They usually aren't part of our military forces. They're outside the law. And just by the names of a lot of these movies, when you think about the connotations of just the names, it becomes, kind of clear what's being suggested. toughness, strength, and superpowers. Iron Man, the Dark Knight, Man of Steel, not Limp Noodle Man, Man of Steel. That's Superman, for those of you who don't know. Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America, the Avengers. They are avenging things for us because we are powerless with all our police and military. Yes, we're powerless. We need superheroes to fly through our fantasies of crushing the bad guys outside the law, outside of public institutions, outside of the military, outside of police. We need supermen. And, every once in a while, maybe Scarlett Johansson as a little superwoman. We need supermen to accomplish these goals for us outside of established rules and law. Because established rules and law, they kind of suck. They're obstacles to be overcome. We need Batman. We need Superman. We need the Incredible Hulk to do in the bad guys. Why? Because what do we have? We have President Obama. Good evening, my fellow Americans. If we're immersed in superhero stories and kick-ass vigilante revenge movies all the time, where essentially a lot of those protagonists are superheroes themselves, and then we're confronted with the person who is apparently the most powerful man in the world, and all it seems like he can do is wear a suit and talk to us. What a bummer! What a letdown! If Americans are being beheaded on YouTube by ISIS, awful, tragic, disgusting, how are we not in our minds fantasizing, yearning for the superheroes that we're immersed in all the time? In our movies, in comic books, in video games, in TV shows, especially in movies. And how does President Obama not seem like a pale loser imitator for what the situation calls for? Unless he's going to tear off his suit and fly off and then just kill everyone in ISIS and then end of movie. I don't know, it strikes me as highly unsatisfying. He's talking about a 3-year plan. 3-year plan? I'm used to this stuff taking like 100 minutes. I don't have the patience for a 3-year plan. And all your highfalutin talk is boring to me. Punch them out. Shoot them down. Talk a little bit more like President Reagan did. At least he talked like he was in a movie. Or like President Bush did. At least he talked like he was in a movie. That's a little bit more satisfying to my fantasy life and my needs, my fears, my powerlessness, my anger. What you're doing, it's not very satisfying. Whoop. Why is this not showing up now? There we go. Thank you. Okay. So, something to consider about the list that I just showed you and these kinds of movies is that they don't include my favorite example of these kinds of movies. Might be one of your favorites as well. And that's Taken, which was a runaway surprise hit early in 2009. And I love this poster. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. But if you don't let my daughter go, I will find you. I will kill you. Not only is that a perfect encapsulation of the captivity myth, like someone stole my daughter and wants to sell her into sexual slavery, and she was a virgin, and that makes it even worse. Apart from that, it perfectly encapsulates kind of I don't know much about foreign policy, but I do know that whatever emerges as a threat, we should just stomp it out and kill it. Doesn't exactly, advocate for a lot of understanding. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want, but I'm going to find you and kill you. And boy, is that going to be satisfying for me and for you, the audience. So I'd like to take us to take a quick look at 8 or 9 minutes from Taken, which I'm guessing that most of you have seen. But this is about 2/3 of the way through the movie, and he is about to confront a lot of the bastards who stole his daughter. And he is going to, he's going to kick some ass, is what he's going to do. So let's watch a little bit of Taken. So, I love how Taken takes place in France, and all of the French are just obstacles to him getting what he wants. They're a bunch of wimps and corrupt bureaucrats, and it's part of the obstacles were to him getting what he wants, which is finding his daughter, and he kills a lot of people on the way to doing that in superhero-like fashion. Now, does everybody who sees Taken suddenly adopt a view of what America's role should be in the world, that America should be Brian Mills, former CIA operative, rampaging all over Paris, killing people to get what he wants? No, not everybody who watches Taken is going to be affected in that way. But I think the extent to which Taken is so similar to so many other movies where superhero-like macho men go outside the law to use violence to solve problems does kind of incline us as a culture, not necessarily each of us individually, but it inclines us as a culture to have kind of ready-made explanations for what might be appropriate responses to what goes on in the world, especially threats that make themselves apparent in the world. We react to movies in different ways, but we are a culture that is shaped in significant part by our myths and narratives, and we get a lot of a particular kind of myth and narrative through movies like Taken. And I think it's something for us to consider maybe relatively more seriously than we usually do when we just assume that an action movie like Taken doesn't have any significant messages. It's just a ruthlessly efficient, action movie. Hell, it's only 91 minutes long. But it's like a machine getting a rise out of us and making us root for, I don't know about you, when I'm watching him torture that guy, I'm going, yeah! Torture until he dies! Such a bad person! Get some vengeance for all of us! People like that, they need to be squashed! I'm not proud of that response, but I think that's my response. The fact that we're not usually aware of that, or the fact that that might also be shaping our values and beliefs, doesn't mean it's not happening. Doesn't mean that those things can't be extended to a grander scale when it comes to how we see maybe what American might, not individual might, by superheroes and macho men at the movies, but like American might, how that maybe should be used on a world stage, doesn't mean how that those things don't sometimes come together, especially when we are relying on mental shortcuts, which I think a lot of us probably are. So this is what I'm not arguing here. I'm not arguing that crafting effective foreign policy is easy and that if it weren't for the fact that, action movies get in the way, we'd all live in peace and harmony. No. The world is much more complicated than that, and I'm not arguing that something like ISIS is no threats whatsoever, or that dealing with that development would be easy if no matter what kind of values we were bringing to bear. I'm also not arguing that it's that easy to be an informed, rational American citizen. The fact that we are shaped in part by, for example, movies is not some indictment of us. We're human beings. I'm not arguing that American military force is never warranted. I'm not arguing that Hollywood studios and filmmakers are willfully and intentionally making propaganda. No, I think flat out they're trying to make money. And they do what they feel like works in the easiest way. I'm not arguing that all Hollywood movies are bad. I love Hollywood movies. I'm not arguing that we're all affected by Hollywood movies in the same way, that we're just brainwashed and we respond accordingly like a switch being flipped. No, we're more complicated than that. And I'm not arguing that Hollywood movies are the only part of media that should be part of this equation. We also would want to examine news and how they tend to cover crime, how they tend to cover terrorism, how they tend to cover foreign policy. TV shows, 24 and Taken are like, the brother and sister of, kick-ass vigilante action movies, especially in how they say torture works and is good when the good guy is doing it. And video games. Are there a lot of video games that are like, instead of being first-person shooters where you confront problems by shooting them down, are there any like first-person diplomat video games where like there you are and you're walking around the United Nations building and you're trying to solve problems as a diplomat? Like Grand Diplomat Auto or first-person like foreign policy grad student at the Harvard Kennedy School video games. Nope. First-person, like, intercultural understanding video games. Nope. A lot of the very most popular video games are, you are killing the problem in order to get to the next level and keep on solving the problems. Not with understanding, not with diplomacy, not with talk, not with any of that. You are solving the problem with violence. And it's fun, isn't it? It's just playtime. Doesn't have any greater meaning for us than just the fact that it's playtime. That we're constantly solving problems with violence in a playful atmosphere and assuming it doesn't affect us? No, that's not meaningful at all. But just as there are no first-person diplomat video games that I know of, and if there are, they're probably incredibly unpopular. There aren't a hell of a lot of movies out there that are about the heroic virtues and problem-solving efficacy, usefulness and effectiveness of public institutions, of constitutional rights and human rights, of intellectual curiosity about the world. Where are these movies? Maybe an indie every now and then? Maybe Oscar bait every now and then? Movies about how great the United Nations are. Not like the United Nations is a perfect institution, or UNICEF, or the Peace Corps, or a movie about reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Syriana was kind of about that. Or diplomacy, or just as a principle, nonviolence. Are you all like big fans of those kinds of movies? I'm not. I wish I were. I wish they were making them, and I wish I liked them, but until there are more of those kinds of narratives and myths circulating in the culture, And until we immerse ourselves in them and often rely on the lessons that they teach as essentially mental shortcuts, when we're weighing what is right and wrong and weighing we should be as citizens, weighing what America's role in the world should be, you know, if we're weighing those things, and if you imagine kind of a scale where we're weighing different options, maybe there are like 5 different parts of that scale. One of those 5 parts of the scale is going to have somebody leaning on it with a lot of weight down on the option of use violence to solve the problem and do it outside the law if you have to, because that's what works. Someone's going to be leaning on that part of the scale as we weigh what is right and wrong and what America should do in the world. That part of the scale is always going to be weighed down by our myths and narratives of superheroes, macho badasses, and, you know, satisfying movies that have problems solved, often with violence, in an hour and a half or 2 hours. If we keep kind of living in that fantasy world and relying on those narratives and myths, we're going to keep playing out the same Hollywood script, but in real life for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you for a really stimulating talk. I know if we don't get to our other movie pick, that's fine. We'll take some time and talk with our speakers. You have time to speak with us. It gives a lot to think about. You all seen these movies? Have some questions about it?
I'm happy to answer questions. I don't need to go until 6:30. You may want me to go sooner than that, but I don't need to go until 6:30. One at a time, please. One at a time. Don't fight over this. Yes. I think you're right. I think you're right. And were more people to watch documentaries and find them fulfilling and interesting and stimulating, I think that would be pretty meaningful. Unfortunately, compared to how immersed we are in superhero movies and kick-ass action movies where violence solves problems by the end, relatively speaking, how readily the kinds of, you know, stories that get told in documentaries are sort of part of our, you know, framing of the world, that there isn't really any comparison. And along with that, even to the extent that we do watch documentaries, the people who study stories would make the argument that, as I think that quote mentioned, it may be that our intellectual guard is up a little bit more when it comes to things that are nonfiction, because we almost feel like, okay, there's an argument being made here, and where's it coming from? Whereas if it's an entertaining story, we don't assume there's any kind of argument. But I think you're absolutely right that these kinds of things are being communicated in movies. It just tends not to be fiction feature films. Yes?
So you were talking about the Hollywood screenplays, their structure of it.
Yeah.
I know you kind of talked about TV shows and video games, but do you think that the TV series have that exact structure, or do they kind of just follow?
No, they don't. Their structure is a little more complicated. There are different kinds of structure. There's the structure of what a season of a TV show looks like. So, for example, at the beginning of a season, the writer's room on a TV show will break the story, as they call it, and map out, oftentimes on 8 whiteboards like that, what the story of the season is going to be. So there will be a season structure from beginning to end. And then each individual episode has its different kinds of structure, which, depending on whether there are commercial breaks, sometimes they'll say that the action is rising going into a commercial break and then falling afterwards. And yeah, the structure is a little different. With video games, the structure varies. I think a lot of it depends on sort of what kind it is, the different levels you're working at, to what extent you're playing on your own as compared to, let's say, simultaneously with 10 other people. I would say the structure of them are often pretty different. By the end, what you often find is there's still kind of that myth of like violence is regenerative, violence solves problems, and it's certainly more exciting, you know, unless you're disturbed by violence, like if you're a sane person, it's certainly more exciting than people just talking. I mean, people talking isn't necessarily that cinematic. So yeah, TV shows and video games, I would say the structure is not as uniform, but oftentimes they say the same things. Yes? I have. I don't know much about it.
They address a lot of issues, and there's games for the young 18-year-old, all the way to adult, and they're not as intensely exciting as violence and all, but they definitely make you use your brain to solve things. So there is that, you get that kickback from, hey, I solved this. And it's everything, you know, poverty, immigration, war, peace, everything. It's, check it out. There is a whole movement to give a whole spin to games. See it in a different light.
It'll be interesting to see if those can catch on as more than just sort of a kind of educational or progressive subset of games.
They have major conferences every year.
That's great. That's great. Yes.
The whole concept of mental shortcuts, do you think that's like in a negative way or a positive way?
I think it can be either. I think without mental shortcuts, we'd all, you know, either there are different kinds of mental shortcuts. I think we all use them because if we didn't, as a means of just giving shape to our experience and sort of framing our experience, the world would just be like chaotic stimuli that we're completely confused by. I would think some mental shortcuts are maybe not so healthy, and some are useful and appropriate. I think it really depends, and it depends on how much, you know, how much knowledge exists as part of it. Yes.
Do you think violence in like animation movies, like children movies, or is like kind of leading kids up to be wanting that violence and like in action in movies as they get older?
I think that's possible. There certainly is some violence in animated movies for kids that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be violent, and there certainly are a lot of, you know, animated TV shows. I watched a ton of them when I was a kid, where violence was part of solving problems. I mean, I used to watch. Speaking of superhero movies, I used to watch the Super Friends. Superman and Batman and Aquaman and all of those, you know, superheroes solve problems not by talking things out with the bad guys, by, you know, kicking the bad guys' asses. And the sense I get is that, yeah, especially for, you know, kids watching who can be somewhat more, you know, easily influenced by what they're engaged with, that, yeah, that might be teaching some of the same lessons and essentially training them to want those same kinds of narratives and myths in the more grown-up movies they might watch. Yeah.
Do you think the idea of like an anti-hero, protagonist, like Breaking Bad, selling drugs and fighting the FDA, all that kind of stuff, is good in the sense that it makes you like think outside the box, which is all that?
I have really mixed feelings about that. Yeah, what we've seen for the last 10 or 15 years is much more on TV, much more complicated protagonists, from The Sopranos to Breaking Bad to Mad Men to The Americans, where the heroes are Russian spies, to House of Cards. Yeah, to Dexter. Hell, Dexter fits this kind of situation, this kind of framework, these kinds of narratives and myths to a T. Like, he's a killer, but he just kills bad people. Go, Dexter! I'm ambivalent about that. I think it makes for much more interesting programming than people who just wear white hats and who do good things and we cheer them on, because the world is more complicated than that. At the same time, the fact that the anti-heroes are usually straight white guys, and they're doing bad things for what they perceive to be good reasons to solve problems and get what they want, and we are more or less invited to cheer them on, I think sometimes some of those shows end up being somewhat similar to these kinds of narratives. So, for example, a lot of people who really like Breaking Bad, and I'm among them, even after Walter White has just gone off the deep end in terms of being an evil bastard, we're still rooting him on. And his wife, who is mostly a good person, fans of Breaking Bad hate her with a passion. The old bitchy ball and chain, they call her. The actress who plays, Walter White's wife, got death threats. Got death threats from fans of Breaking Bad. You are so annoying! He's just doing it for the family! Well, no, he also then clearly likes being a drug lord and killing people. And the fact that she was often getting in his way, she got death threats. The actress who played her. It's just entertainment, and we know the difference between entertainment and real life. Fans of Breaking Bad gave the actress who played her death threats for supposedly being such an annoying bitch. That begs the question whether we get a little too invested in these stories and end up rooting for these, awesome badasses as they do what we want. I would suggest that when I was talking about, fear, powerless anger, I think especially for men, some of the appeal of Breaking Bad is this is your average Joe Schmo, high school science teacher who at the beginning of the show is just a wimpy loser. He's not a wimpy loser as the show goes on. I think a lot of us feel like wimpy losers. I mean, I'm a, moderately successful person. I'm huge. I'm strong. I'm a jock. I feel like a powerless wimp sometimes. Watching Walter White kick ass and be a drug lord, I think that satisfies something in me. Oh, it would be awesome to be a violent drug lord, not to have to take anything from anybody. Thinking that that's not going on for a lot of us under the surface, and that that's not somehow meaningful for how we see ourselves, society, the world, I think is naive. Yes?
Not why you got into that kind of thing. It's to say this is because, not like watching Breaking Bad, but like knowing that there's like those needs.
I've always just been fascinated by media, especially movies and messages of various kinds. And yeah, I tried to understand myself along the way too. Yes?
So you said there are a lot of messages that you see and taken, but aside from going outside the law to get what you need to get done, what other messages do you see?
The French are corrupt, bureaucratic bastards who, in the lead up to the Iraq War, They didn't want to join the coalition of the willing, and how wrong they turned out, right? Because the Iraq War went really, really well, and they got that wrong. Oh, no, wait. They didn't really, because the Iraq War was really messy and difficult and didn't go so well, and they didn't want to be a part of that process. Well, when he goes abroad to get his daughter back, same thing. The French are in the way. They don't want to let Americans be Americans. Dark-skinned people are, suspicious and evil. All the bad guys, aside from the corrupt French bureaucrat, all the bad guys are dark-skinned Albanians. And the guy who has his daughter and is going to, deflower his daughter essentially via, sexual slavery rape at the end of the movie is a guy named Rahman, who is clearly, we are supposed to identify as Iraqi, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Syrian. He's Middle Eastern. He's a fat Middle Eastern guy. So another thing that we learn is, people of color, foreigners, bad news. And finally, that girls and women are powerless and need saving, especially if they're virgins, especially if they're your 17-year-old virginal daughter. And if his daughter hadn't been a virgin, probably not quite so important to save her, because something's a little off. If you're not a virgin, that probably means you're bad. These things are all communicated under the surface. Yes?
So you talk about problems and all that stuff. How do you think reality TV and the Kardashians and even what's it called, Dave House, whatever it's called, fit into these whole purpose? There you go.
I don't think they fit this per se. I could talk for hours about what I think the meanings and messages are in that kind of programming. It doesn't fit into this, but if anybody thinks that you can watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians over and over and over again and watch a lot of reality TV and it has no effect on your values, Godspeed. Denial is not just a river in Egypt. I would suggest to you that we're a little more complicated than that, and we might be affected in ways that we're not realizing. The fact that, I had a hard day, I'm going to collapse on the sofa and veg out. Oh, Kim's butt looks especially big this week. The fact that we don't consciously think that there's anything serious going on doesn't mean that we're not being affected in a variety of ways. And I could talk about that for hours. Yes?
So you're talking a lot about the reasons why this is happening and things like that, but I kind of, and what could make it better, but I kind of wonder whether or not you see this as more of like a cycle or just kind of like an endless feedback loop. Do you think this is never going away, or do you think there's any way? Ideally, if we examined what ideal masculinity is, that men being tough and violent is a really substantial sort of component of what ideal masculinity is. If we examine that better and sort of were able to aspire to something a little bit more enlightened, that would help. I don't think that'll be easy. If we did more media literacy and critical thinking when it came to sort of examining media and the messages that they communicate to us, that would help. If people responded with their eyeballs and their ears and their spending money and consumed more complicated stories, that would help. These things are possible, but probably not that easy or likely. I mean, there are solutions. It's just these are things that are, for the time being, seem fairly intractable to me. Not that they can't change, not that we don't have the ability to change them. That's something that I try to do in my work, but it's certainly not easy. especially since, hell, I like action movies, and I'm studying someone who does this for a living. Imagine how sort of difficult the progress that needs to be made is if I am easily sort of hooked by these kinds of myths and narratives. Maybe last question? Yeah.
You were talking about how like superheroes, they're not realistic because we can't expect that in real life. How do you feel about like when you research it, you find that a lot of the superheroes are based off like propaganda from the war, from the 80s and stuff like that. Different cartoons that are made.
How do I feel about that?
Yeah, because it's unreal to get their standpoint from some cultural aspect from a long time ago. They just bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it not that different from other kinds of myths and narratives where, in some ways there might be an agenda behind it. So, for example, Superman, originating in the context of like the Great Depression and then eventually, World War II and being a standard bearer for American might and strength and potency and values. Hell, Captain America seems very clearly to be tied up in, kind of propaganda goals. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes it a little bit that much more disturbing if we don't maybe examine them a little bit more closely. All right. Hey, last question. Yes.
In your opinion, do you think that these vigilante movies are justifying any actions, extreme actions that the U.S. might take when battling the war on terror in the future?
They don't do so explicitly, and they don't do so by standing on a soapbox and head-on addressing foreign policy, but symbolically, I think they lend themselves to that kind of thinking. Yeah, that if we see a lot of stories where the good guys see the existing rules and laws as insufficient to get justice, security, revenge, what have you, and it works out for them by using violence to achieve their goals and arrive at more or less a happy ending. Well, when we're confronted by something like 9/11 and we're used to certain kinds of narratives of how things unfold when you are attacked by evil people, well, it doesn't suggest that the narrative that we are going to want to play out as part of real foreign policy, it doesn't sort of lend itself to us saying more peace and understanding will eventually result in fewer 9/11s. No, and by the way, I'm not necessarily suggesting that that was the way we should have responded to 9/11 because there were clear threats. But yeah, we might just sort of feel like it's natural to play out the kinds of scripts that we've seen in movies, even when they're not about terrorism or war or foreign policy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.